we're taking a look at this CV730 engine on this Dixon mower. Customer brought this thing in and said that it doesn't run off choke, and if it runs very poorly. We're going to show you how to check this out, diagnose it, and figure out exactly what's going on if you have a similar engine on your machine. Go ahead and first off like and subscribe if you enjoy the content. You can also hit the bell. Get notified anytime we release a new video. Again, this is a CV730. The first thing I notice when I'm looking at this is that the fuel pump's been replaced. This customer likes to mess with some of his own equipment. He's a repeat customer. He brings stuff in all the time. I think he buys it from auctions and sells it. Aftermarket fuel pump, normally not a good idea. A lot of times they don't work right. Don't put out enough pressure to keep this thing running right. Either way, the first thing we want to confirm is that the fuel is good and that the fuel supply is good to the machine. That is, of course, after you check the oil, make sure that there's no gas in the oil. If there's gas mixed with the oil, that means your carburetor's failed. It has allowed fuel past the seat and it's went into the crankcase and mixed. You'd want to flush all that out and address a carburetor issue if that was your problem. If your oil is real low, fill it up before you run it and test it and things like that. We're going to check the fuel supply first because what we get as far as running goes. Let me show you. Basically, as soon as I take the choke off, the machine dies. Sometimes you can keep it running by feathering it and stuff like that, but it does not run well regardless of where that position is. We check this fuel supply and see exactly what's going on. This one does have a fuel selector that sits right here that you can select and turn from right to left to show you which tank, choose which tank you want to pull from. This is on the right tank, and all we're going to do is we're just going to take this fuel line off. Since these bottom feed, some tanks will come from the top of the tank and suction up out. These actually come from the bottom, so they're gravity fed. We don't need to test from the fuel pump side to begin with. All we have to do is pull it off and drop it down, and we're going to get full flow out of it. Now, from what I'm seeing there, even through the fuel filter, that is a steady flow. The fuel doesn't look too terribly bad either. It is clear. Doesn't smell too bad. I will normally drain the fuel if we have an issue like this, but we're going to go further before we do that. The fuel does look good. As I'm looking, or as I'm seeing this run, what I'm hearing too is I'm hearing a blown head gasket. I'm hearing that whooshing noise. That noise that you're hearing means one of these head gaskets is blown out and it's seeping to the outside somewhere. You can have a blown head gasket and it may not make that noise. It may be seeping to the inside and you could be pressurizing the crankcase. An easy way to tell is remove your dipstick. See if you get any smoke coming from the dipstick tube. If you do, you very likely have a blown head gasket. As you inspect down and around the head, if you're looking down under and you see a spot where there's oil leaking in between the fins under here, this side it's seeping very badly, that's where the head gasket's blown out. This side over here is actually just fine. Normally when you replace one, you'll replace them both, but it depends on you. What do you want to do with it? I've already talked to the customer about this. I've already told him his head gaskets were blown. He doesn't want to fix it, doesn't want to spend the money on it, which fine, whatever. But you will have lower power if you've got a head gasket blown on one side. To test this engine and make sure both sides are running independently, we're going to just unplug one spark plug to test each side independently. So if I unplug this spark plug and that side runs with this one unplugged, we know that that cylinder is good. You've got two cylinders on this. And then we're going to do the opposite. Some people like to put a spark plug in it and just ground it out, just to ensure that the coil does not fail. It's a little less difficult on it. So we know it's running on that cylinder. No problem. Do the same thing on this side. Now, loss of power issues are very hard to diagnose sometimes because they can be intermittent. You know, sometimes it'll happen once it heats up and things like that. Well, if it shuts down after 15 or 20 minutes, most times people think it's because it's overheating. That could or it could not be the case. Sometimes that's the case and it'll be one of the ignition coils stops firing after that amount of time. Other times it's because the fuel supply isn't getting a good enough flow to keep it running. There could be debris or something in the tubes. Happens a lot on especially the fuel lines that are pulled from the top of the tank. It gets caught in that elbow at the top. These are gravity fed. It's a lot less likely to happen on something like this, but it is still possible. Test this side. Now you can hear just how bad that whoosh is on this side when I do that. Both of these cylinders are firing. That means we've got compression, at least some compression at this point on this side, but both of them independently are working. Our spark's working, we've got good compression, we're getting fuel. Now, why will it not stay running if we're getting good fuel supply? The only answer to that is a carburetor issue. You can test that also if it's dying out on you by spraying carburetor cleaner or starting fluid in the intake. If you spray that down in here and the mower stays running, then you know that it's a carburetor issue. This one back in here. So we know we've got a carburetor issue or an issue with bad fuel. Okay, this fuel, I would really think that this is not the case of bad fuel with the look and of the smell of it. You still can also test your output from the fuel pump. This fuel pump, again, is aftermarket. I'm gonna see if I can't convince him to put one of the OEM ones back on it, but it's up to him. See what kind of flow we're getting out of there. I mean, I'd say that's a pretty solid flow. It started up and ran pretty good there for a second. That's a pretty good flow. That, in a matter of just a couple seconds, means that we're getting plenty of flow from the fuel pump. We know that's not the issue. Carburetor is the issue. Now, I talked to the customer about this, and the first thing he said is, can we get an aftermarket for it? Well, sure. I mean, I could clean and rebuild it and all that, and he's a repair and replace guy, apparently, so he's got an aftermarket carburetor. I'm going to show you guys how to put that thing on. You can clean the carburetor out. There's, I'll show you how to do that while we have it off, but also replacing it sometimes is the best option. Now, I normally won't put an aftermarket carburetor on something like this, especially when it's something, this has got the accelerator pump and everything on it. I've actually never done one of these with an aftermarket. This will be my first. Let's see how it does though. When you're testing your cylinders independently, if one or the other is not firing, you know you have an issue with either the compression or the spark on that side. If you have the spark plug out, all you have to do is take a rag or something and hold that spark plug against the side, and you can test that spark and see that spark very easily. Now, we use spark checkers, so you just clip it on the outside, but if you're holding this to the outside and you don't see spark, if you're grounding that plug out against something, if you don't see spark there, a lot of times I'll come back to the engine stud, it's a little bit better, but if you don't see spark in between the middle and the outside probe, you know that there's an issue with the coil or with the kill wire or with the kill of the engine somewhere. It could be any of those. Test each independently. Figure out what you're missing from the equation if you're missing something or if it won't run on each. In this case, this one seemed like it barely wanted to run. Could be a head gasket blown out so bad, if you're hearing that whooshing especially, that you're losing all the compression. It won't run on that much compression. As I look here, it's got some metal patches on the exhaust where the exhaust tubes come out. That tells me this thing has been running very hot for a long time. So I don't really know about this repair. We'll figure it out further as we go. But first thing I want to do is get all this cowling and stuff out of the way. There's 4 8mm bolts holding this whole bracket on. 2 here, 2 there, and then 2 up at the top here that hold this to that. But we're going to take all that off. Looks like they've got a bunch of stuff kind of rigged and zip tied and everything else up. It may have been something that the current owner had done or something somebody did previously. It's hard telling. That's a 9mm. Apparently I grabbed the wrong one. Sometimes these bolts will break off on you. It does tend to happen a lot on these machines. Two on that side off. Now we got the 2 on the other side. And then again, the 2 up front, 1 on either side here. Apparently I have a nut on the back. And that appears to be 10mm. And there was a washer on the back also. Alright. And that puts the top free, and that puts this mounting bracket free. There is also some mounting that comes down to the top, and it usually screws through the top down into the housing, I believe. That's how it normally goes. It looks like on the other side it's been completely rigged in all manners also. And we've got our cables, 1 on either side. I'm going to take those off now. Just mark them with a marker for where they go. Paint marker. Makes it a little bit easier for putting it back together later. Mark which notch it went in. This one here went in the middle. And then we are going to have to take this arm and everything off, but we'll do that in 1 second once we're free. I don't believe it has to come off before. I'm not sure exactly what size he's got going on there. Kind of a weird deal with some of this stuff. He's got all rigged up. But with what we do, we see that a lot in small engine repair. People put things where they don't belong and try to make them work. This one looks like it may work okay. One on the other side is not connected at all. Take that other cable off. Mark it first. So we take this nut out of the other side. I can show you real easily how everything comes apart for the top. Might be the best route for me to go. And that's just a nut and a bolt holding it together that shouldn't have been there to begin with. There's two 10mm nuts on the front. I'm going to take those off. And that should allow me to pull this whole housing out and away. Wow, that was on there pretty tight. Well, top of the housing came off anyway, because normally there's a C-clamp there that holds this together. Apparently they didn't think they needed that. Oh well, we've got everything free except for our breather tube, which you can take off either side. Should just pull straight out. I'm having some difficulty because of the fuel line being in the way, so I'm going to take the fuel line back off. Pull up and then straight out. Kind of at the same time as we're coming off. Get all that stuff out of the way. I'm going to leave that sitting just like that so we can put it all kind of back together exactly the same. Now I've got a pretty good view of the carburetor. I wanted to show you exactly how the choke cable was set up here. So it was over to the side, just like such, hanging out. So to take it off, obviously just take it out of the bin. Should know where that one goes anyway. We need to take our throttle control off of the top here in order to get this rod out of the way. If you look, I'm not sure if you can see down at the bottom, but I'll get a close-up of exactly how this stuff should go back together, because it can be a pain sometimes to figure that out as you're doing it. And we'll loosen this up, and it goes bracket, and then it goes spring, then there's a washer, and then there's this piece. So we'll remember how to put that back together. I've had these carburetors apart, you know, 100 times plus, probably this year, honestly, but they are one of the more difficult carbs to get apart, to rebuild, especially the ones with the accelerator pump. I'll show you a little bit more about that here shortly. Gasket is broken. I'm going to unplug the after-fire solenoid. And on this part, as we removed it, I just kind of dropped it straight down, and I'm just going to kind of let it hang here. The spring could fall off and things like that, but normally it stays right where it should be. This is all loose. We're going to take our choke linkage off, and it just clips and comes right out. You don't want to lose that. If that falls out, a lot of times you lose it. But and just set that down. And I'm going to take the linkage out of the way. Goes just like that back on. So now we have it where we can actually pull this carburetor out of the way if there wasn't a ground wire here. Now there's a ground wire right here that is in the way we do have to take off. Yep. Doesn't want to come like normal. Let's get it started with some pliers. Get a good grip on it. And you want to make sure that wire, that ground wire, gets hooked right back up when we put this back on. If it doesn't, you will not get anything out of that solenoid when you go to use it. I went ahead and got the fuel draining because it was still dripping there. It's just draining into a bucket gravity feed right now. As we're looking down here, try to get that out of the way a little more so we can see a little bit better. The clip that holds the throttle in, the throttle linkage, just pushes to the side. So it just clips onto the linkage. So if you push it to the side, you can just pull straight out and the linkage comes out. Now this spring wasn't hooked up at all. That may have been why we were getting some surging on the high end. Somebody apparently has had this apart, if I had to guess anyway. Now we pull out. Oop, it's still getting caught at the back. And the frame appears to be in the way. So that's no fun. Normally the frame's not in the way, you can just pull it straight out. In this case it is in the way. I'm gonna take this stud out. What I'm gonna do is grab it with a pair of pliers, and on this one there's no other option. You can't just take a back piece or a back cowling or anything off. You've got to take the stud out of the way. Now I can rotate it up and pull it off. Just gonna put it back in there just like that. Have it hold there. Again, this piece down at the bottom for the throttle, it's kind of locked in there okay, but make sure you don't lose it. I'm gonna take it out. You don't want to lose that for sure. Set it to the side. Again, carburetor's free. It's seen some better days though. Let's unbox this carburetor that you sent. Let's see exactly what we have. Has a ground wire up top, which we'll be removing because we'll be using the one from the machine. It's got a solenoid that looks good. It has the accelerator pump like it should. The fuel line comes in at a little bit different of an angle, but I don't think that'll be an issue at all. Everything else does look like it'll work. Again, I'm not 100% positive, but we will take this spring off. Maybe. And we'll take the linkage out. It's the wrong way. It looks like it needs to spin around. There's only one way that these will come out without ruining them. There's a notch. I'll show you in a second as soon as I find it. So that just kind of pulls out, but there's a notch in the one side, and that's where the other side doesn't have that notch. So that's where it has to come up and through at. It's through just like that into it. Otherwise it won't go in right. And it needs to sit in there. Again, we're gonna put the new carburetor on it, but I'm gonna show you how to clean the old one if you're needing that. Many times we'll throw ours in the ultrasonic cleaner. It'll go real well. Yeah, don't ever use those. Apparently can't use it anyway, but I wouldn't use it. I like to use the fuel clamps and the shutoff, but other than that, don't use any of the rest of that junk from those kits. Not the spark plugs or anything else if they come with them. Fuel line, if it's all cracked or anything like that, you can see this one's kind of swollen a little bit. I'm gonna replace that fuel line while we have it off also. Take it off just to get it out of our way. Now if you're cleaning or rebuilding this, 9 times out of 10, if you're to this point, these can be completely brittle or torn or anything like that. You may want to replace those. Really depends on how bad they are. Again, these all have cracks all the way through where they go in. You want that to seal or that accelerator pump will not work right. You can take that accelerator pump apart. You will have to take it apart here and there in order to get the bowl off. Now, I'm not trying to be gentle at all. I'm not trying to reuse any of this stuff. If it's something where you're wanting to reuse it, you've got to be very gentle. Cut those zip ties first. But again, most of the time, if you're to the rebuilding point, you're gonna need to replace that stuff. Take the bottom off. You can use the correct size wrench or just a pair of pliers. And be sure not to spin the wire down below and break that wire off. I've seen people do that a lot of times. Just keep spinning and spinning, and then it spins the wire and got a whole nother issue. Now the solenoid, you can test this very easily by plugging it in and seeing if it works correctly. Down in here, there's a plunger. You will want to clean, because if it is not moving freely, you'll have an issue. This is a main jet. You will want to be sure that that is completely cleared down through there. You can use a torch tip cleaner or whatever else you need to, but you should be able to see a perfect circle, and there should not be anything in that jet on either side of it. Clean it all up. Now here it actually, I thought it actually came out with these two twists on each other. A couple 3/4 inch wrenches will work just as well. Take it apart just so I can show you. And do note that there is a gasket right here also. So don't lose that or let it come off if you're going to reuse it. As we open it, you want to make sure there's no gunk or anything down in here. If there is, all around these walls, there's also a spring down in there. This should spring back freely each time. I mean, there's a little bit of stuff in there. This carburetor actually doesn't look bad. We could rebuild this carb, no problem. Again, customer just asked and provided a carburetor for it, and I'll do whatever the customer wants. I wonder if maybe he opened this up and cleaned it at some point or something. I don't know. I mean, it's hard telling with people at different times exactly what they're thinking or doing. The accelerator pump on the side, we'll take it apart, but let's take the... Now one of these sides is flattened. That side, it has to pull out towards that side. If you pull it out towards the other side, you'll break the stud. Want to make sure this is completely clear and everything like that. If there's anything on the inside of this float, then the float's not floating. That can be a big issue. Let's take off the top. And we'll take off the accelerator pump. Take a look at it. Looks like my table's dropping over there a little bit. That's kind of strange. It's here on top. It's all in pretty bad shape. I replace this gasket most times also. And then there's a pilot jet up underneath, which I'll take out. And that goes all the way down through. You'll make sure that's completely clear throughout. And it's just a tiny little hole there, but it is a tube that goes all the way down. If you don't take that out, you can't get the rest of this jet down in there out. That screwdriver doesn't work for me. You got to get something that's wide enough that it's going to take it out, and you don't want to strip it. I kind of try to push everything in as I'm turning, and that usually helps not strip that brass out. And there's your main emulsion tube. You make sure this is completely clean. All the jets down through are clean. Again, you can use a wire brush to clean all this. If you're cleaning one spot at a time, you can just pull a loom out of it, clean all that up, nice and easy. Or you can use like torch tip cleaners or anything like that. Torch tip cleaners work great to just poke everything out and clean it. We'll clean everything out down in here. You want to make sure around the sides that there's nothing along that area that can stick that float up, make it flood the crankcase. Just up and down with your torch tip cleaners or with the wire brush or however, and blow out back through. Make sure that there's not something stuck at the elbow as it goes in there, because it's just a tiny hole where it lets it drip down. Many times something could be stuck on the backside, and that'll cause the fuel flow to shut off also. This is ready to be cleaned. As you clean it, you can blow all down through the jets. There is another jet up front here. I normally don't take this one out, but I clean down through it, just blow down through it with a, yeah, see, it's not wanting to come out. Again, I normally just blow down through it with a carburetor cleaner. and compressed air to clean it, but taking it out's never a bad idea either. Clean that jet real well, and then blow down through there with carburetor cleaner everywhere, and then make sure it's all clean. All around here, all down through. Everywhere that you can, it's not a bad idea to blow carburetor cleaner and compressed air down through. Blow it all through these passageways. I like to put it in the ultrasonic. That cleans it pretty well without having to worry too much about blowing it off, and then you can clean it right afterwards. Just with carburetor cleaner. I'm freeing these up just with this. Makes it a little easier a lot of times. They get stuck. So your accelerator pump, as we take it apart, it's got a spring that sits along right here. Take it off just like such. And if you look in here, if you see that diaphragm is hard. That diaphragm is not going to do what it's supposed to do. This diaphragm would need replaced if this carb is going to be rebuilt. Otherwise, it's never going to work right. Never going to work right at all. And then you can also take snap ring pliers and get this other piece that's down in here out. You'll rebuild all of this, again, if it's in bad shape. Otherwise, you can just clean it up. But I mean, just looking at that, that's definitely not right. It shouldn't be all shriveled up and stuff like that. It's basically hard. I mean, you'll have a little bit of something there, but it won't be hard like that one is. This one's real stiff. You don't want a stiff diaphragm. That should tell you everything you need to know about cleaning the carburetor. Make sure you don't ruin this gasket along here. Make sure everything goes back on how it should. All of this should be completely crack free. It's a good motto in general, I think. Let's see. I think we're ready to go ahead and put this other carburetor back on. Again, I am going to remove this screw here and remove that wire just to get it out of the way. Let's go ahead and reinstall it. I went ahead and removed the stud and scraped off the gasket at the back to get a fresh starting point to go to. Put this back on. Again, this stud's gonna have to come back out anyway. Looks good. I like to get this keeper back in there before I put the carburetor back on. It goes from the back side, remember. And kind of swing it to the right so it's out of the way. We've already got our linkage on like it should be. And then I like to grab the spring at the bottom. And I like to put it in first as we go towards the back. If you don't, in my opinion, it's harder to get in afterwards. It's kind of difficult to get in general, honestly. There we go. Got it in. Now we can bring the linkage straight up and push it in. I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to really see that on here, but the linkage just pushes straight back in, and then you lock it in. You'll push that clip from the right hand side to the left, and you'll hear it snap in. Now, I don't have the stud back in yet, obviously, but I'll put it all back in now that all that's together. You can do that first also. It doesn't really matter which way you do it. Again, normally you don't have to take the stud out, so you may not even be dealing with that portion. After you push it back, make sure everything stayed exactly how it should have. Pull that up out of the way so we can see a little bit better, hopefully. So I got my spring in first, and then I just push the linkage that way, and then my little tab just pops right back on from the right to the left. Not too difficult of a process. let's go ahead and put our screw back in the top real quick. For our ground wire. Tight. I'm going to go ahead and plug the solenoid in. Make sure it's nice and tight. And then since the fuel line coming from here to going there, it's changing directions a little bit, and this one has cracks all in it and is a little deformed. I'm going to put a new fuel line on it. I'm going to use that same guard though. I cut it just a hair longer because of that change in angle. I don't know how that's going to affect things. Shouldn't hopefully affect them too much. And that just keeps that fuel line from getting too hot, sitting right on that muffler basically. It's pretty tight there. You want that nipple tight, that's for sure. There we go. And I think I made it maybe even a little too long. Snip it back to where it was, kind of the same size. Again, you don't want to be real close to that muffler. The further away you can get, the better. About like where we were. Let's pull this back up and we'll start reinstalling it. I'm going to get a real good close-up of exactly how this should sit. So as you're pulling it up, you should be pulling that spring just like such, pulling it to the right. This one's in the second to bottom hole. Should be about even as it sits up top here, and we tighten everything down, and that's what will pull in order to engage your throttle. All of this, wrong hole. Goes down in like such. Again, this is going to be a little bit different on yours because these two screws are going to screw down into the plastic as opposed to how they are here. That's how most of them are set up. I'm going to get that choke linkage here done very quickly. I think it's usually a little bit easier if I do it after I get this installed, if I remember correctly. So we've got it just like it should be. That's your stop to control how high that your throttle actually pulls on. And then we'll just tighten this down. As long as you're holding it at the bottom exactly how we just described, it'll be perfect, and it'll pull it right up to where it needs to be. In good shape right there. We can reinstall our controls now. If you move it to low throttle, it's a little bit easier. You get a little bit more cable to deal with. Just put that Z down in there. This one seems like for some reason it wants to stay at about opposite of where it should be. It's kind of strange. Anyway. It's low throttle. Should be right about there. Right back about where it was, and you can always adjust it later if you need to. Came out of the hole on the back side. Make sure it's down in there so it tightens like it should. Seems like that hole's at a little bit of a slant for whatever reason. I'm sure somebody's tightened it down like that. Good there. We can get this choke linkage fixed up here. Put your Z in. Pull it back to where it needs to go. So those are good. Again, we'll have to put this on here, but we've got to have that other bracket on here also because that's where it secures for the air filter. We'll do that last as far as it goes. And then on this side, they basically had a nut or a bolt coming up through the bottom and then a nut on the top side. I'll reinstall that. And just a few. This goes on the opposite side, so you've got to put that Z through and then you've got to kind of snake it around in order to get it for the choke and line up. We're going to go choke on in order to get it into a little bit better position where we can put it in there, and then it'll come from the back side also into the hole. Push it through. Doesn't want to go in on this one for some reason. There we go. Now we're good. Now all of our controls should work. You can test them. Turn your choke on and off. Obviously it doesn't want to work real well because this doesn't want to stay, but throttle works. Low throttle, high throttle. Okay. So all of our controls work. We know that's all good. We can put the rest back together. Gasket on the in between the air cleaner cover and there. Now we can snake this all back through. You want to make sure that's real clean. That one's not. Otherwise you'll suck stuff up in there when you're operating it. Blow all that out real good. At least I think actually the air compressor is off right now. I always try to make sure that I don't have it go off while we're doing stuff like this. And just clean all that gunk off there also. Not really going to hurt anything, but always a good idea to be clean as possible. Command Pro 25, it says. Again, you got to kind of snake it back through at the same time. Seemed like it went on a lot easier than it came off. Still don't like how close that fuel line is to the exhaust. I notated that when I took it off though. Never really liked this design because of that. Even though it does have a heat shield, so I am going to get a hose clamp so we can put this back on. No reason not to have a hose clamp and have it on there correctly.
Again, very weird one with it being not standard parts, but there we go. Oop, that slipped the thread or something. It looks like it did. Okay, weird. I don't know what happened, if it pulled one up out of the bottom or what, but it wasn't real tight. The other side, I'm just going to get that bolt up through. It's going to be a real difficult one. Okay, I'll worry about that here after we get the rest of it fixed up. Washer on the back and a lock nut on each side. Again, washer on the back, then a lock nut. There's a hose for that breather that needs to go back on while we're right there. Tighten this down. And then we'll put our 4 back in the valve covers where they came off from. Oop. That's a 10, not an 8. Trying to rush and get ahead of myself here. I'm going to put some anti-seize on these. Again, these are some of the most likely bolts to break out of anything. At least we know these will come out next time. Hopefully they don't have a next time for quite a while. Nuts for the front. I'll put the air filter and stuff back in. Again, I will get a hose clamp for that. That should not be without a hose clamp. We got all the fuel drained and everything. The tank blew out real well. And I got the filter and the fuel line going to the fuel pump, and I'm gonna replace that also. I took that off. The reason being, I know now that anything past this fuel filter is gonna be filtered. It's not gonna get into that new carburetor. On this old, I'm just gonna cut it back a little bit. You can see where it's kind of notched up pretty good, but it's not all cracked or anything on the inside. So I'm not worried about replacing it. Otherwise, if it was, I'd tell the customer, hey, we need to do this to make sure it's not a restricted fuel line. This is a OEM Kohler filter. I like to use these on this all the time. And we use Continental fuel line. It just seems like it's good quality, a lot better than some of the other ones I see. It doesn't get hard real quick. Some of those other brands we've used, seems like after a couple of years they're real hard. You don't want your fuel line to be hard. With that aftermarket fuel filter or fuel pump, it's not wanting to accept this fuel line at all. The angle too. Plug our spark plug back in. Other one's in also. Give this thing some fuel and we'll fire it on up. You do want to be wary if you have two tanks and you have a fuel selector that you are actually draining both tanks. Making sure that somebody else isn't going to select the other tank and ruin all the work you just did because you didn't drain one tank or the other. That's if it's bad gas, of course. Fuel goes bad very quickly though. We use ethanol-free fuel and we treat it with Phaser 3000 right now. As soon as we run out of that, we'll just use the 2-butoxyethanol. That is a surfactant, I guess is what they call it. It just reduces the surface tension between the water and the fuel and kind of mixes it back throughout. So it keeps phase separation from happening. Okay, let's see. Choke on, throttle on high. Let's see what this thing does. Well, there you have it. The carburetor worked, right?
Sounds great. I'm very surprised with as many hours as this unit has on it, and blown head gasket and everything else, how well it actually runs with this aftermarket carburetor. Would I put it on my machine? Probably not. You know, just for the price of it on a big commercial unit like this, I wouldn't trust it, but it may stand up to the test of time. We don't know until we have it on there. Again, I've never done one of these. I'm going to save all these old parts in case he does need it rebuilt at some point. We can do that for him. No problem at all. Hopefully this helps somebody rebuild their carb or diagnose their issue or helps in some way, shape, or form. Thanks for watching, guys. Go ahead and like and subscribe if you enjoyed the content.